Today, October 15, 2020, I, Maya Hill, the interviewer, will be interviewing Miss Yosette Jones Johnson for the Black Student Alumni Oral History Project. Location is over Zoom. So welcome, Miss Yosette. Thank you so much for taking the time to join me to be interviewed for this project. I am super excited to just hear about your experience at Penn State. So just to jump right in, could you just state where you're from and when you were born?
Yeah, so my name again is Yosette Jones Johnson. I was born in West Philadelphia. That's where I grew up. And I was born on June 18th, 1950.
So, how was life growing up in Philly? Did you experience any forms of discrimination as a child, or how did your parents kind of prepare you for going to school in the 1950s, 1960s?
Well, I had an interesting experience. I grew up in a West Philadelphia row house, and my parents moved there when I was 3 years old. I really grew up there. I attended public schools. I really got to know my neighbors well, and um, prior to moving to West Philadelphia, we had lived in Westchester and really had no neighbors. So I was very excited when we moved there that there were families with kids. So I grew up attending public schools. I have a brother. He also attended public schools. And my family worked in ed and higher ed. So my father worked at a historically Black public college outside of Philadelphia called Cheney. And my mother was a high school English teacher. And so I began to kind of know about discrimination through them, actually, and through my neighbors and through their experiences. So my mother, who originally was from Brooklyn, was had teaching as a passion. And when she tried to be hired, even though she had worked as a high school briefly as a high school English teacher, a public school teacher, when she tried to apply in Philadelphia, Philadelphia wouldn't hire her because she was Black.
Mm.
So mom worked at the public library, but teaching was her passion. So she went to work in Camden. Camden, New Jersey would hire. This meant my mom had to do a real schlep. She didn't drive. She took public transportation all the way from West Philadelphia to Camden with two young kids every day. And so that made a serious commute. When Philadelphia did open up and start hiring Black teachers, my mom did never change back, so she did her entire career in Camden. So just kind of seeing her leave early and schlep all the way to Camden and come back every day uh, later than most public school teachers, I guess got in there somewhere. I wasn't as conscious of it when I was growing up, but certainly it's meaningful. It's a part of our family history. So my brother and I grew up knowing that. Um, when we first moved to our neighborhood, my neighbors on one side was a white family, but the white families were, and there were a few other white families left, but they were leaving the neighborhood pretty much as I grew up and as we got older, to the point that by the time I was in high school, I don't think there may have been one Black family left on that block, but um, that was it. By the time I was in high school, I went to Overbrook High School. At that point, Overbrook High School was also still integrated. So many of the teachers were white teachers, and some of the students were white students. But every day in homeroom, a white student would say, okay, I'm leaving because I'm going to the suburban school district. So where Overbrook sits is very close to the City Line Avenue. And so people would go to Upper Darby or they go to Lower Marion or Upper Marion. So if their family moved and they could qualify for a school district outside of Philadelphia, literally by the time I was a senior, people were literally leaving every single day in my junior year and senior. And you noticed it in homeroom because it was like really white flight in high school.
So in that experience and noting that you were actually witnessing, white flight, like what did, I guess, how did that make you feel? Like, how did that make you, begin to understand that, again, people don't like me because, or they don't want to stay in the same environment or community as as I am in, due to race or due to other other means. Like, how did you? I guess.
Well, the way I had experienced, I was fortunate in that both of my parents had gone to college, and so I had grown up. I mentioned my father worked as a college administrator out of Cheney. Mom was a high school teacher, so I was fortunate in the sense that both of them had gone to college, and even my grandfather had had some years of college, though he didn't finish a degree. So I was fortunate in that the expectation was kind of baked in a cake for me. Um, I think for my parents, they began planning for my brother and I to attend college from the time we were very small children. And I think we had that expectation. I think what the experience of having people leave that high school was for me that that high school wasn't good enough because it was becoming more and more Black. And so that was kind of the slap in the face that this was a school that was on the decline, in a sense that it wasn't good enough for the white students to continue attending. Even though whites had gone there for generations, it was no longer a place where they could launch their lives and launch their careers. That was a sense. Of course, it wasn't spoken, but when people are exiting like on a regular basis, you kind of have that feeling. Now, that said, many of the people in my graduating class and class before me, I know some of them have done extraordinarily well and are very accomplished. But that, when you're 16 and 17 and 15 years old, you don't know what the future holds. You just see what's happening day to day.
So with the expectation of your parents, in being in higher education and public school education, and you having that expectation on yourself that I have to go to college, how did you hear about Penn State and why did you choose Penn State? Your dad worked at, I don't want to say it's the first because there's competing, between if Lincoln was the first or Cheney was the first, but one of the first.
It was Cheney.
It was Cheney. Okay.
Well,
Okay. Thank you
Cheney
for the
was the
correction.
first public one. Now, whether
Okay.
Lincoln was, because Lincoln was
Okay.
private, so publicly funded, Cheney
Cheney.
was part of the public system. And I got to know about that because my father worked there for many years. Um, so how did I hear about Penn State? Well, um, I mentioned when we moved to the block was, I guess, an important feature in my life. Some of my neighbors were older than I were. And so they had already kind of made the transition from school and were attending college. Um, and in fact, one of my very good friends was at Lincoln, had gone to Lincoln. I think she graduated a year ahead of me. But also, there were people at my church who were attending Penn State. So I sang on I wasn't a good singer, but I sang on the young adult choir and that kind of thing. And so I had friends who had gone to Penn State or who had brothers and sisters who were going to Penn State. And so it got mentioned in that context. And then beyond that, Penn State was a big football school, college football. And so you would see Penn State mentioned on college television. And I considered, my parents were married at Hampton. My father went to Hampton. Um, And so I kind of always seen the historically Black college thing. I used to go to Cheney homecomings. We went to Hampton homecomings. Like that was like a, so I had kind of seen that role and I was like, oh, I'm not doing that stuff. I want, you know, a different kind of experience. I didn't want to go to Temple because I felt that was going to be a continuation of high school. And again, I wanted a different kind of experience. I did not want to kind of do the commuter school thing. I wanted to go away. I wanted the sense of independence. All of that were important to me. That said, I did apply to Fisk. I was accepted at Fisk. But I thought about going to the South, where my grandparents were from South Carolina. One set of my grandparents were. And I thought about going all the way to like where Fisk was and having no sense of it. And somehow, and then it being the South, I mean, like the real South, I said, that may not be the choice for me. And I think that really pushed me more toward Penn State, the opportunity to go away, but also to have kind of more sense of familiarity because I'd heard more about it. And it was still in the same state.
So what year did you enter into Penn State? And you ended up attending, you mentioned to me prior, a Commonwealth campus before going to main campus, Dubois. So can you just talk about that first year experience on on the Commonwealth campus?
Well, it's an interesting segue because while I had this trepidation about going to Tennessee to attend Fisk, I didn't have that same trepidation. Um, and that was part of my growth and development as a freshman in going to Dubois. So when I applied to Penn State, I guess they had so many applicants. At least I thought this at the time. I was disappointed to learn that I couldn't go into main campus because main campus was filled. I'll get back to that later. And so I had to go to a campus where there was a dorm, and Dubois was open, and Dubois had a dorm, and I didn't want to go to Ogans. Ogans was a campus right outside of Philadelphia. Um, and I didn't want to go to Delaware campus because again, it would be the commuter thing. I didn't want to do the commuter thing. So that pivoted me toward Dubois, which was very far away. What I didn't know was that Dubois was an all-white community. I mean, I'll get to that with some of the questions you asked. But as it turned out, a friend from high school who was also made a Penn State decision decided to go to Dubois also. So she was the secretary of the school. I was the treasurer of the class. We knew each other. We were friends. I mean, we didn't really hang out together, but we decided to room together. We were both going to Dubois. We were both from West Philly. We were both from Overbrook. And so that was the decision we made.
So did you I know Penn State was giving out like scholarship money for, African American, or maybe they weren't. Correct me if I'm wrong. But
No,
were
it's an interesting kind of thing. When I said my father started planning for us to go to school, my father started buying bonds as soon as he started working. And he put those bonds away and put those bonds away and put those bonds away. Um, Whether there were scholarships available or not, um, I may have tried to apply for some of them. Um, but I didn't qualify for most of them, and I ended up really not getting any kind of support other than what my parents provided for me. And so it was a real sacrifice for them, even though fortunately both of them were working. But that's how I was able to go. I didn't really qualify for financial support. And I must say that at the time, as a state college, even though any fees are like daunting to a family, once you have to pay them, and at that time we were on the tri-semester system, so you had to pay fall and winter and spring. But still, compared to other universities, it was much less expensive than, some of the privates, even some of the privates in the area.
Okay. So your first year at Dubois, you mentioned, like I said before, prior from talking, I'm going to quote this. A professor stated that it's not safe for African American students to be on campus. So,
Well, so the experience of, let me step back from that comment, and I'll go there. But um, so we get to Du Bois. I'm there with great excitement. I've checked off. We're in this little dorm across, and the school doesn't run the dorm. The dormitory is independently run. At those days, they were segregating the men from the women on the floors, and so they there was a floor and a half for men and a floor and a half for women. The women were on the upper floors. And it was called, I think, Penrose Hall, across from the campus, or a little bit on the outskirts of town. But this is a very, very small town. Remember, I'm coming from Philadelphia. This is a small town. It is very, 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 excuse me, it is all white. There are no black people. Is no black community. For us, it took forever to get there. I mean, we passed State College. Du Bois was like an hour and a half more up in the mountains from even where University Park was. So it ended up that there were 6 black students. There were 5 black women and a man. 3 of us were from Philly, and the other 3 were from Pittsburgh. That was it. When the black man got there from Pittsburgh, his father drove him up to Du Bois on the first day. He stopped for gas before he got to this little dormitory. The gas attendant said to his wife, "Come on out here, come on out here. There's a black guy out here. I haven't seen a black person in 20 years. And he called his wife out to come out and see this student who had arrived at Du Bois to go to Penn State. So that was the reception that we got. And that's, that gives you some sense of what it was like in that area. Now we learned, one of the students I met had attended West Philadelphia High School. So the third person from West Philly had a neighbor who had been at Du Bois the year before. And so I think that's what propelled her to think, okay, if she could go, I could go. So that was kind of the experience walking into so for us, even though there was clubs and we had enthusiasm, it was a very, very strange scenario for us not to have any of the black community around. So I mentioned we had been church going. We had like cultural things, even just your neighborhood things that you just took for granted, like the hoagie shop and the this and the that, and being able to see your friends, or just being able to see other black people. Nothing. You saw deer hunters coming up with the rifle racks, going up the street between the dorm and the campus, because it was deer hunting country. It was a hunting area, a big hunting area. There's a big state preserve up the street or something. None of the black students had cars. And so we were like up behind the mountain, only these little 6 black students by ourselves. So one of the things that we did, the black girl from West Philly and I were card players. So we would play cards against the white boys, because what else was there to do? Again, no internet, barely any television. We didn't have television in our rooms. There was one television in the dorm. There was a radio station. It was country western and popular music on like 1 or 2 stations. So we're playing cards, and one of the guys, he was kind of a jerk, but one of the white guys who was playing cards mentioned that, oh, by the way, I heard that they killed that King guy. And he was speaking about Dr. Martin Luther King. That's how Charmaine and I found out that King had been murdered. We were playing
Mm.
cards with these guys in April, the spring semester of our year at Dubois. We had tried to participate in clubs and different things at Dubois, but it was a very lonely, very isolating thing. When we went home for Christmas and Thanksgiving, it was like, oh my God, we are so, I mean, it was a whole different kind of approach to going home. And maybe a lot of freshman students felt that, but I felt it very acutely. Um, so one of the things we had done to try to reduce the sense of isolation was somebody from the Baptist church in Dubois had invited us to attend. So we had gone on one Sunday. Well, after King was murdered, we're looking for refuge anywhere because, again, there are no newspapers covering this. It's hard to get information. We're only getting information really from national news. There's no local TV station. There's very little information. So we went to church that Sunday, and for some reason, it must have been a small church. We were sitting upstairs, and the pastor says, well, thinking about this King guy, I'm not going to say he was a communist, but he certainly was no Christian. And so my mouth flew open, and I picked myself up with the other two sisters that were there, and I walked out. And um, that was like a pivotal decision for me because I had never walked out of a church before. But I could not believe that he was dishonoring King in that fashion from the pulpit for his whole congregation. Now, this is my naivete because I had only attended Black churches, and so I thought church was church. But
Mm-hmm.
I learned at 17 church is not church. Church is church for Black people, and then there's white folks. And, I hate to say it that way, but that's what I experienced. So then I called the woman who invited us because I didn't want it to go unnoticed that I left and why. And I told her how offensive that was and how I wouldn't be coming back and how I thought it was just horrendous. And so on top of that, we there was one white instructor who had been very sympathetic for us. In fact, she sent us a little note after King was killed, and it read, "Dear Charmaine, Yosette, Shirley, Janice, Janet, and Larry, although I have lost, and we have all lost, a great leader, the tragedy is most personally yours. With sympathy and still with hope, Miss Ashley." And so we had organized a couple of students and the Black students who were there. Two of the Black students got to go home for weekends a lot. The Pittsburgh folks had rides and were able to go home a lot. The Philly people in the main were not that able to go home frequently. So we organized this little march. Now this was the 60s. We didn't have natural hair at that time, so we had little pressed hair. I had on my Easter coat. This is not raggedy jeans and people with their fists pumping. And this is not people yelling out and saying, what we're going to do. We're not yelling no justice, no peace. This is a memorial that has a banner memorializing Dr. Martin Luther King. And so we walked through Dubois with this banner. It's a silent march. We're all dressed like we're going to church. Pretty uh, uh, honoring King. The way we felt we should honor King. And the next day, the Dubois newspaper. I've lost my copy. I'm very upset about, but I'm trying to get another copy because I want to share it with you. It had even Dubois has a march. And so our picture with our little banner from our little march, it's only about 15, 20 people, whatever it was, is on the front page of their newspaper. Well, this same teacher, within a couple of days, who wrote us this note, pulled me on the side and she said, if you go into town, try to make sure you go with a white person because there have been death threats against you guys. Um, and I was, that was stunning. Of course, I told the other Black students, but at that point, we realized our isolation and our vulnerability because we had no one to go to. And the administration of the college never said a word to us. We wouldn't have known if that instructor who had been sympathetic hadn't said something to us. So we were very, very careful. We had one incident. There was a white student with whom we were friendly. We went out for grinders, I think they called them up there, one night in her car. And a group of white boys followed her on the way back to the dorm. And that was very unnerving. We got back safely. But then we were on a countdown to just get out of there because we said if we got out of Dubois, we were never going back, and we've never gone back to Dubois. So that was like our freshman year eye-opener. And that's where the death threat thing came in. That was, it really made us all realize that we were up there without community, without support, where an administration hadn't even told us, much less take precautions to safeguard us, hadn't even told us of the threat. We realized we were in the real America.
So when you guys went back, or when you went back on for Thanksgiving break and Christmas break, did you end up telling your parents about those incidents, and what was their response?
Well,
And their care
remember now, this is
for
our freshman year. So we started in fall of 67.
Mhm.
King was killed in spring of 68. So it was April. So it was really after we had been home. That's why I said once King was killed, our desire to get out of there and to go home was really heightened. We had about a little bit more than a month, 5 weeks left of that semester, because at that time, I think the semesters were ending mid-May, like second or third week in May. So we had those 5 or 6 weeks of finals to get through. I will say that after the incident where we were followed by these like white, and maybe they were just having fun or just whatever, but the idea of being followed through these streets at night by these folks who you don't know what you're going to do was so unnerving. So we had finals the next day. It was really near the end of the semester. And one person, one of the Black students was so unnerved she couldn't even study. So we called the instructor and we explained to him what happened. And he excused her from the final and made ways so she could pass the course. So we all were able to pass and get out of there and move on to the main campus the next year. But the thing that I learned, and this is just my theory, is that when I met other Black students as sophomores, one of the things I found was that many of us have been denied entry to the main campus. And I wondered about that. I mean, Penn State was a land grant institution. So I wondered why it was so many Black students had to go to a campus the first year before they could go to the main campus. And I think either through my father or someplace else, I learned that as a land grant institution, that if you had the grades and you passed in high school, that they had to accept you. They couldn't just reject you and say, forget it. So I think the way that they handled many of us from the cities was to, especially the Blacks from the city, was to make you go to a campus. And if you survived that experience, you could continue on at Penn State and you got the honor going to the main campus. Because I later found out from other Black students I met that some of them had been in Mount Alto, they had been at other campuses that sounded similar to Dubois to me. Some of them were close to, like the Pittsburgh people went to campuses that were close to the Pittsburgh, but almost to a person, many of my friends had to go to campus the first year. They didn't just go. One sister I know of went straight from, she was a Girls High graduate. She went straight from Girls High to the main campus. The brothers, I think, in the main, many of them did get to go to State College, but not the Black women, which I thought was interesting.
So just to ask further this theory of yours and kind of try to ponder upon some other, I guess some things that could possibly come from this theory. Why, I guess, noting that you were able to talk to other Black women who did not get accepted into the main campus, how did that kind of perpetuate this idea that a lot more Black women or even African American students were not getting admitted into the main campus immediately, but they went like either sophomore year, junior year, or even senior year? So like, how did, I guess, in talking to other individuals, how did that perpetuate the theory in which you kind of came up with, based off of your experience and then the experience of others?
Well, Maya, I'm not a researcher, and at the time, again, I'm very young. It's anecdotal kind of information, but it was interesting. I watched it with a lot of consistency. I think it began to change at some point near the end of my tenure at Penn State. But in those early years, we came to the main campus as sophomores, not as freshmen. And at the time, I guess if I had to garner my reaction would be, this is not a sign that somehow this is something I had to get over. This is not an inadequacy in me, the fact that I had to go to campus first year. This seems a little more systematic because so many other people had that same thing. And so that's what I was left with as I began my sophomore studies and I began my time at the main campus. That was like a revelation for me, I would say. And then the people who had gone before us that had the same experience from Philadelphia. So those three women, and they were even lesser in number than we were. Oh, I'll tell you one other thing that was interesting. So apparently they were very good singers. And so when we got to Dubois the year after, and we become friendly we know the people who were there the year before us, we came to know them later. So the people asked us, the administration people asked me, so do you sing like those other girls sang? And we were like, what do you mean? Oh, they were really good singers. Are you guys good singers too? And so that again was a revelation. They had that expectation that if you came from the city and you were a Black person, I mean, for them to even ask us that is very revealing.
Yeah, continual stereotypes that are out of, racial, I guess, biases. But when you got to Penn State in, I guess, fall of or winter of, I guess it had to be fall of 68,
yeah.
Fall of 68. How was your experience different? Yeah, no, you're fine. How was your experience different or even similar to your experience at Dubois? Because going to the main campus, the number of Black students was about 1% at the time. And at Dubois, it was only 6 of you guys at the time. So how did that, how were those experiences similar? And I guess, how did you get more involved in maybe pushing for more Black student enrollment or getting involved with the 1% of Black students at Penn State to form a community?
Well, I'll tell you what the change was. During our Dubois years, again, the friend that had the neighbor who had gone before us to Dubois and then on to Penn State became a Delta. And so
Mm-hmm.
during our Dubois year, we had the wonderful experience of going up to visit her and meeting people in the Delta suite. And the idea that there was that, there were um, more Blacks there and we got to meet more Blacks there. um, we were looking forward to, at least I'll speak for myself. I was looking forward to going to the main campus because I knew there were going to be more Black people there. I knew from prior visits. And so when I arrived as a sophomore, we were all the way out in East Halls. At that time, there was nothing across from East Halls but actual cow pastures. I'm not joking. There were cow pastures there. East Halls had just been built. And so we had a good ways across from campus. You didn't necessarily see that many Black people, but there were other Black students in our dorm, in our little hub area, I guess whatever they used to call it, where you went for dining and that kind of thing. And so I just really gravitated toward uh, other Black students, meeting them, connecting with them, knowing that there were AKs on campus, getting to know, because it was the type of situation where we were so few that I think, all attempted to gravitate toward each other, to bond, to try to form community, to make friendships. So, because it was more about, you mentioned 1%. At the time I was there, I just knew we were in a sea of white people. So to me, it was more about surviving academically and socially and culturally, getting through, getting through. And so making the connections of friendships of other Black students, male and female, was vitally important. And so I would say to you that that was like really my focus. You were getting letters from home and this and that and the other. Um, but that was really our focus. I really didn't engage in how can I, work toward changing this big institutional picture. It was more, how am I going to get through? Figure out how to deal with the classes, figure out how to deal with the brutal winters. Uh, you know, no, I had
Yeah.
never been in a situation where once you put boots on, you didn't take them off again until like April or March or something like that. It was like a full boot situation all the time. There was either snow was coming, snow was there, snow was going away. So it was like, so we were figuring all of that out. I was trying to figure out all of that, and to manage so that I could proceed through school.
So, how did joining a sorority, as you mentioned, how did joining a sorority help you build in sisterhood with other Black women that allowed you to propel, as you mentioned, also in your academics? And also, could you mention what your major was?
Okay, sure. So I was invited to join the Deltas and invited to join the AKs. My mom happened to be a Delta. I
I'm
knew.
glad you made. I'm glad you made the right decision. I am so glad. Yeah.
So, for me, there wasn't that much of, I wanted to be a Delta. I had worked with a Delta the summer before. I went to even Dubois. It happened that I worked in a VA hospital, and one of the other Black uh, people working there, students, was a Delta going to Temple. So I met her and she encouraged me. And of course, my mom, uh, that's what I'd heard about during my life was the Deltas. So I made that choice. And it was a wonderful decision for me. When we pledged, there were 10 of us online. Um, and it was a real opportunity to gain in togetherness, collaborating and coordinating, all the things you do when you pledge, and then becoming a part of something larger, and something larger that extended beyond Penn State. So all of those things were of benefit to me. And so it wasn't so much that it was easy, but it was meaningful to me because of the relationships we formed. There were a great many of friendships that have abided to this day. My roommate also pledged when I pledged. The other black girl from Philadelphia pledged. Um, the one of the black girls from Pittsburgh pledged. So out of the 5 black women who had been at Dubois, 4 of us were line sisters at the main campus.
Okay, so we're going to just jump a little bit to student activism. We're going to take a little leap over into student activism and
Okay.
talk about the Douglas Association and the 13 demands that were presented, which is in 1968. That was the first set of demands. And then in 1969 was the second set of demands that were made. And one of the main demands was increased Black student enrollment, like increased Black student enrollment. And I guess my question for you, why was that so prominent for, I mean, I can take a guess for myself, but why was that so prominent for a lot of the Black students there? Why was it so important to get more Black students on campus at that time?
Well, um, remembering now, so for the first set of demands, I was in Dubois, so I really wasn't a part of that. I was there in '69, and I pledged and I joined the Black Student Union, and I wasn't one of the people who was really fostering that activity. But um, I should step back and say that being in the sea, you know, I don't even know the numbers, but being like 1% of like 35,000 people uh, really gives you a sense of isolation and in some vulnerabilities. And so the reactions, in my experience, range from out and out hostility to complete indifference. And so if you're experiencing that from an administration, that administration, the college presidents was friends with Richard Nixon. Um, Nixon came in on a helicopter for one of those PSU football games. So they were tight. Um, this was the mindset of this administration. And I think we were there because we had applied, we had succeeded. They didn't have a way to throw us out, but I think they were, as I said, either hostile to us or indifferent. We didn't matter, and so we recognized each day of going through 3 years of classes where most times you are the only Black person in that class for 3 years. It's got to be vitally, everybody feels that, every man, every woman, you feel that and you just say, this isn't right. There should be more Black students here. There's no reason why they aren't. This is a purposeful situation. So I think that undergirded the experience for us of trying to make demands to have greater participation uh, at, Penn State for Black students, greater opportunities, and not just students. I think I had one Black instructor the entire time I was at Penn State, which is disgraceful. I mean, it's disgraceful. There may have been some Black graduate students, but they weren't by and large teaching courses that I had. Um, and I want to step back and just talk about the role that students had. Yes, the activism was very important in making demands on the institution, and I think those demands did make a difference. But I also want to just spend a little bit of time just mention to you that the Black students who were there created a sense of community. And that sense of community was important for all of us. So the Alphas, the Kappas, it was the kind of thing where even if people weren't particularly fond of each other, didn't particularly know each other, when the Kappas had a party, they invited the Black people. When the Alphas had a party, they invited the Black people. And where there were cultural festivals, by and large, almost every Black person kind of participated, played some role, because we were creating a sense of community. Um, I remember there was a Black Kappa, Clark Arrington, I think, became president of the Penn State Jazz Club. Well, that was powerfully important. He brought James Brown to Penn State twice. Uh, Once when James Brown had just made I'm Black and I'm Proud, and being in that experience and being in that audience and having that affirmation in a place like Penn State was very powerful for us. And so when we created programs like this, again, teenagers, very young adults, doing this without support from outside, um, it I think was a growth experience for everybody who was involved, very meaningful. So doing African dance, people adopting natural hairstyles, uh, wearing African garments, all of that was reaffirmation for people who were there. Again, we didn't have 52nd Street in Philadelphia. We didn't have Broad Street in Philadelphia. Um, we didn't have the different streets in Pittsburgh to go to. We didn't have the Black neighborhoods in Harrisburg to go to. And one of the things that differentiated us, I think, from other college students is in Philadelphia, you have Penn, you have Drexel, you have Temple, you have LaSalle. There are other students close by. We had the Nittany Mountains. Very few students were coming up, had the resources to come from Howard to Penn State, even to come from Cheney or Pitt to Penn State. So occasionally that happened, but we didn't have the same kind of cross-fertilization. Again, no internet with students at other places. And so we're relying on traditional media, reading, music to try to get messages in because we're in a very isolated location.
So is there any, I guess, demonstration or protest that you specifically remember that took place by the Black students on campus, whether it was building the brick wall in the president's office, I think that was like 1969, or if it was the football, protest where students walked out on the field during halftime, or any other of the various different demonstrations, or even, for example, I know they held rap-ins, which was a sit-down table talks for students, for African-American students, but also for white administrators to learn about what African-American students were, in need of. So do you remember any of those events? And if so, which one would you say, most important to your experience at Penn State?
Well, so I can tell you in the spring of '69, I was working, trying to earn part-time money. I worked at the main library, which unfortunately I don't remember the name of, but I know it was like this majestic, huge edifice on top of a hill. And we have been having protests in different locations, but at the president's office, kind of making demands such as what was going on in other places at other campuses. And I remember one day coming out from my work and seeing state troopers coming up like in riot gear onto the campus. And again, I'm the only Black person that's like in that space at that time. And I remember racing back from the library to Simmons Hall where the Delta Suite was, and like just alerting everybody, all the Black students, people who were involved in protests, calling the fraternity houses, calling McElwain where the AKs were, and telling them we are being occupied by state troopers. Um, and as a result of protests, one of the things that I remember is the uh, leaders of our BSU were arrested. Um, some of them, I think maybe about 7 of them, went to Clarion, I guess where the local jail was, but 2 of them were sent to Lewisburg Penitentiary. I knew those guys for several days. They shaved their beards, they cut down their froze, and it was just a kind of terrifying, again, a terrifying experience um, for people who were only involved with trying to make changes at Penn State to be sent, like they tried to pick off leadership and send them to a state penitentiary to send them a message of the kind of control they had over the situation. That semester, I think, is the same semester where a student was murdered by the state troopers at Kent
In
State.
Kent State, yeah.
And so one of our sorority sisters had a sister who was attending Kent State at that time. But Penn State, like other universities that semester, fearing for greater protests, just canceled the semester and they sent us all home and gave everybody passed them on their courses. So, that of course is a memorable situation because students were dying. And again, I don't think in my mind, and at the time, I didn't think that we were activists like the people at the lunch counters and in the South with the students in SNCC and in the civil rights protests and the civil rights movement were undergoing. I didn't think there was really a comparison. In hindsight, again, given the fact that we were all just students and we didn't have the support of a community. I mean, Philadelphia, there were people that supported me. Don't get us wrong, they would come up to school and speak and help advise us. But there in the college itself, we were really kind of coming up with things on our own and producing them on. There's one in the instance before I moved into the Delta Suite ship, which I think I really only lived in for about 2 semesters. I was in I went from East Halls to the dreaded South Halls. I think I was in Hibbs, and going through the dorm one day, the white sorority on the first floor where their suite was doing a skit in blackface. And so I remember being outraged by that. I wrote to the newspaper. I think they may have covered it a little bit. I wrote to Pan-Hellenic and told them how offensive it was. But, you had asked before about what the climate was like. It was pretty much like, well, whatever. So, all those years ago, now people talk about it. It's still kind of like, people like the governor from wherever did it when he was in college. This is the same kind of thing. This is what was acceptable, and that's what they did. And so we did what we could to make our outrage known, but we were met with this kind of indifference.
Okay, so before we, wrap up, I have some more questions, but I want to kind of jump to a little bit more of the fun experience during your time at Penn State. So in May 1969 was the Black Arts Festival. What do you remember, and why was that event so important for, again, I know it was for to build culture, to build community, and also to educate the white students and also Black students at the university at the time. But what did Black Arts Festival mean to Penn State's campus, and what did it mean to you?
Well, it's more, at the time, because this interview has really forced me back into more of what I was thinking and experiencing. And I think at the time I wasn't thinking about Penn State writ large. I was thinking about my experience and again surviving, getting through the academics. And so this was a real opportunity to deepen our experience. Again, I think we were going through tremendous experiences with our own identities. I'll speak for myself as an African-American young woman, our own identities about what being Black was. I mentioned the James Brown and I'm Black and I'm proud, affirming Black identity, I further identifying what Black beauty was. And the Black Arts Festival was a manifestation of all those individual experiences that were going on, at least in my estimation. So I remember at one of these events, I read a poem. I don't know if it was at the festival, whatever, but just participating in it, being a part of something that was so affirming and educational at the same time. So you learn through the experiences of other people. Learn through the music and the drummers and all the different things, the dances that went on. And people really, really had an opportunity to display for all of us immense talent and immense creativity. And so the writers wrote and the drummers drummed and music was created and sung and so forth. Poetry was read and it was just a very rich, affirming growth experience, I think, for the participants and those who weren't actually performers, but got a chance to be a part of that experience, and immense pride in how well it turned out.
So, were there any other clubs that you were involved in at your time at Penn
Well,
State? I know being a Delta, which was like amazing. Uh, you mentioned the jazz club. I'm assuming you went to maybe some of the jazz club events, or
well, I did go to jazz club events, and I enjoyed them immensely too. I should also mention that in terms of student government, I did not after my Dubois experience. At Dubois, I tried harder. I was like an alternate cheerleader for the campus. I have my little letter here from being on the cheerleading squad, and I'll send you like copies of some of this stuff. But I have that, and
wow.
so we traveled around to other campuses and did that. Um, and Charmaine and I, she was on the actual squad, I was the alternate. So we did try at Dubois to do some of that. At the main campus, I don't think I did that much in terms of clubs. I may have done some athletic stuff, um, maybe done some swimming, a little bit of swimming. I wasn't a great swimmer. Um, but I did enjoy the music when the jazz club had something. I did enjoy the parties. I continued playing cards. Um, I will tell you about one experience that I think helped pivot me to my life after Penn State. When we were at Dubois, we had an opportunity. I don't remember how it was to do a bus trip from Dubois to New York City for the weekend. I remember we stayed at the Martinique Hotel. It was a blast. We had a very good time. And I realized that I loved the vibrancy of New York City. I love the diversity of New York City, the opportunity, the energy, all the rest of it. And again, my mother had been from New York. And so the opportunity in Dubois to go there was a fun experience for me. That was a really fun weekend. And so later, I had an opportunity to move there, and I've been here ever since.
Oh, nice, nice. Well, since you have taken us to some of the final questions I'm going to ask, basically reflecting on lifetime memories and legacy, I guess my first question would be, how did Penn State shape your worldview after college? You mentioned moving to New York after having the opportunity to go during your time at Du Bois, but even some of the things that you may have learned, some of the experiences that you had, how did they kind of shape your worldview in pursuing a career or even engaging in whether it be activism in a communal sense, or activism in a larger sense, or even advocating for something within your career?
Well, I'm glad you brought me back to that because I can wander. I can talk about a wide range of experiences. So I'm glad you brought me back to that. So um, I mentioned my folks' involvement in higher education. I had determined pretty early on oh, I'm not going to be a teacher like my mom. Everybody's a teacher. I don't want to be a teacher. So I mentioned that I majored in social welfare. And at Penn State at the time, um, uh, social welfare required you to do a field practicum. And so one of the things I haven't discussed with you is that, um, and even in my notes preparing for this, I didn't write it down, uh, there was another friend of mine who was, again, a line sister in the Delta who had come from a small town outside of Pittsburgh. She and I did our field placements in New York. Um, so there was another sorority sister who was subletting her apartment in the village. And we actually did a semester in New York City where we lived in Greenwich Village. I worked for Central Harlem Health Department, and I think another, yeah, I got my job and I worked for Central Harlem Health Department. And I'm talking about, I'm thinking, yeah, and I don't remember where Wanda worked, but we definitely lived in New York. We worked every day. We had to do our paperwork and so forth because it was actually a credited experience. And that was amazing. Um, it was just amazing. Being in New York, it helped me determine to pursue social welfare as a field of interest. The idea of being engaged and working with other people became something that I felt like I wanted to do and could do successfully. And so it did kind of became a foundation for my field of study. And later, after I graduated and actually moved to New York, not doing social welfare, but another job, um, I still felt that I could uh, successfully go to graduate school. So that's another aspect of the Penn State experience. So the fieldwork experience and doing that in New York and being able to do that. Now, I do remember that our people, social welfare is was at the time a very small department in the large institution, which is Penn State, agriculture, business, farming, blah, blah, social welfare. And so one of the things that the people at Penn State, the coordinators of the program, had to do was come visit your field work. Well, I don't think they really wanted to come to New York City, but they had to come to New York City because that's where we were doing our field work. So I remember that kind of attention where they came and they saw my supervisor and my supervisor's grand lady um, in Central Harlem Health Department, which was on 125th Street across from where, I don't know if you know New York, but it's across, they were just building the state office building all the way back then. Mm. And so she had to come up there and interview my supervisor, who, as I said, was a grand MSW social worker, you know, chapter and verse, living on the ground, doing social work stuff on the ground. So I think that was an eye opener for her. But I loved it. I loved the fact that she had to get out of Happy Valley and come up and see what was going on up there in Nueva York. So that was a great experience. And as I said, the other thing that happened for me at Penn State, and I think this is due in part to the sisterhood I experienced with the Deltas, is we had a grand time together with all the different activities we did. We tried whenever we could to do the community service that is the hallmark of the sorority. And so that was another piece that I think helped me determine what my career path was going to be. I developed wonderful helping relationships, and that experience of being in sorority helped me with my personal growth and personal identity in terms of how I saw myself, how other people saw me, how I could negotiate my way, and how I was successful. I mean, I wasn't the highest average person at Penn State, but I got through. I passed my courses. I made dean's lists a couple of times. And so that experience, when it came time for me to consider graduate school, let me know that I could do graduate level work. I could be successful academically. Even though I hadn't been in the top of my graduating class at high school, I didn't do badly, but you know, I wasn't like the superstar, you know, valedictorian person, but I could still be successful and we could get through. And I think we helped each other get through. You had mentioned I think one of your questions was that I would consider giving up or going back home due to the environment and the challenges we faced at Penn State. I didn't personally, and my roommate didn't personally, but there was one of our line sisters who did. And we used to talk her down every week. Now, she since went on to graduate, and she too went on and did a graduate program and had a successful career. But that sisterhood and that bonding and that sense of community that was created, I think helped all of us. It may have helped us in different ways, but I'm happy to tell you it helped me a great deal.
That's amazing. That is wonderful. Have you? So this is one of the final questions, but have you gone back to Penn State since you graduated? And in your time of, if in fact you went back to Penn State to visit, what was that experience like, and what were some of the memories that you kind of had, and did any of your children or grandchildren continue on your legacy at Penn State?
So it's an interesting question. So I did go back on 3 occasions. They were all very different occasions. So the first time, well, I won't say the first time because I don't remember the exact order. When my son was looking at colleges, another sister and I, again, a Delta, I took my son and her daughter, 2 of us took them all the way to Penn State. I remember leaving from here in New York and going to State College. Well, driving into State College, University Park, as we entered Main Street, some white boys were coming, we were at a stoplight. Some white boys were coming across the street and they banged on the trunk of the car and they were yelling something, and my son said, "Let's go home." I mean, we hadn't even gone to the hotel yet. We hadn't even seen anything yet. He hated the vibe. He hated everything about it. And he said, "I'm out." So we stayed overnight because I said, "I'm not driving all this far for you." But he hated it, hated it, hated it. He ended up at Drexel. He was a New York City kid. He was born and raised in New York. He grew up in New York. And so I think for him, being in a college in an urban environment was important, and Penn State, you know, is not that. So that was one experience. I went back when Epsilon Gamma had its 35th anniversary. So I went back for that, and that was a good experience to reconnect. Again, I don't remember so much time going around the campus for the Penn State sake of it. I really went back for the Delta anniversary. And then there was a third time I went back, and this was a very interesting experience. The Soros from the 60s, we had formed a group called Extended Family Fun, and we had stayed in touch. We had come together through sorority, but after sorority, we expanded, formed this group that included all of our family members. But we took the occasion many years after. I know that Dubois was still alive at that point. We went back and spent a reunion weekend at State College together. So we had a dinner, we went out on the campus, we went to the old Delta Suite, which was no longer a Delta Suite, we visited Simmons. That was a glorious experience, more for, it was reunion for us. So Soros came from Pittsburgh, from all around the state. We got a chance to catch up. We had not done that in at least 2 decades. So that was a glorious experience. We went to the Cultural Center, which of course didn't even exist while we were there. And it was marvelous for us. It was wonderful to see that that kind of resource was available for Black students. And I know it's not enough because there's still a lot of work Penn State, like other institutions, has to do. But the fact that that resource was there was amazing. Oh, and I'll tell you one other thing in terms of the activism. Before I graduated, I was pledge dean for a
Mhm.
class, for a pledge group of 40 people. And that was the biggest pledge class that our sorority up until that time had ever seen. So
Wow.
I'm just talking about, if you can imagine 40 people becoming deltas, that means the admitting class that came with them, I think in the 70s, had really, really, really grown.
Increased.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow, to go back and see the progression, I know that had to be an amazing experience. And even in going back to remind yourself all the different experiences that you had at Penn State, I know that even in doing this interview has probably been wonderful. But for my last two questions, I'm going to put them in one because I think they go hand in hand. So if you were to tell yourself, your college self, one thing, what would it be? And then also, if you were to describe your college experience in one word or one phrase, what would that be and why? So if you want to just answer one, that's okay
Well,
too.
I think if I went back and told my college self uh, something, it would be to have greater confidence and faith in yourself than I did.
Mhm.
I mean, I think I did things um, based on how I've been raised and what my belief system was, but I don't think I had the confidence when I started college that I had when I left. And
Mm.
subsequent to that, I've gained more and more and more uh, through my lifetime. And then if I had to, I guess, summarize, what was the second part? Summarize.
If if you can give one word to describe your college experience, what would it be and why? Or give a phrase.
I think it was a time of tremendous individual growth. So I'm back to that theme again, because I think it was individual growth in ways that uh, helped gird me for other experiences in my life. Um, the I think I was always independent, and I desired independence, and I wanted to build on that. And I think Penn State, being a college student, going through the experiences I did, were um, telling for me. Um, the fact that I saw things, I spoke up. So it wasn't when I was doing them, it didn't feel like it was meaningful or important. But as I sit and talk to you, I go back to when King died, I was 17. When I walked out of that church, I was 17. So there was something there, though I didn't see it or experience it as uh, something meaningful. I see it as more meaningful now than I did then. And that's because my young self didn't recognize
Hmm. Yeah, Miss Yosette, I being able to have an opportunity to interview you and interview the other individuals about your experience at Penn State has just been a great opportunity for me to just learn and also understand where a lot of the things that Penn State came from, like the Paul Robeson Culture Center that is now in existence today, um, the Black Caucus and BSU, which was once the Douglas Association, and so many of the other things, or even the African American Studies Department that I was able to benefit from, because that I received a minor in that, and just
it.
having that just having that opportunity and the opportunity to talk to you guys and kind of ponder on the legacy that you left for so many people, for myself included, and for students to come. It's just like sometimes I'm just left in like in awe of how you guys were able to just manage and maneuver through. But as you mentioned in a lot of the comments that you stated, it was because you guys made it a community. You guys were able to establish community within yourselves and build each other up, whether it be through Greek life or whether it be through a lot of different events that were on campus. So I just want to say thank you so much, Ms. Yosette, for just taking the opportunity to be a part of this project. The interview, I didn't really have to ask that much because you talked into so much, or I guess you talked with so much detail about your experience at Penn State that, kind of just left me like, oh, let me just sit back and listen, because there's a lot of stuff that I can take from it. And in every interview, I've taken something different from it, and then I have been able to apply it to even my experience at Penn State and why I'm even doing this project. So I just want to say thank you so much for just this opportunity.
Can I say one other thing? Because it was part of a question I think I only partially answered. So I told you about my son's experience and where he ended up. But what I didn't share with you is that in more recent years, my son married, and he married a woman from Philly, from outside of Philly, who had gone to Hampton. But her mother, her father, her godmother, and her brother, her younger brother, all are Penn Staters. And
Wow.
I think they all had a somewhat different experience at Penn State than I did. And, we haven't talked about it much, but I am so glad that you're taking the opportunity to talk to those of us, while we still have our memories and still have our voice, and you're providing something that will be there for people who come after us. I just think that's wonderful, and kudos to you for doing it. Thank you.
You're welcome.